his ideas refused to lie down and die quietly beside him. Those ideas have shaped our world more profoundly than Darwin, Freud, or Einstein. They've inspired men and women to fight and die for them, to overthrow old nations and construct new ones.
Karl Marx was born on May 5, 1818 in Trier, Prussia. Born to parents Heinrich and Henrietta Marx, his father was a successful lawyer who came from a long line of rabbis. In October 1835, Marx studied at the University of Bonn, but did not take his studies seriously. Marx's father encouraged him to enroll at the University of Berlin, where he studied philosophy and law and explored socio-political theories with the young Hegelians. The young Hegelians were a group of German intellectuals who reacted to and wrote about George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's legacy. George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was a German philosopher who developed what is known as dialectical thinking, as portrayed in his book, The Phenomenology of Spirit. It is necessary to come first to an understanding concerning knowledge, which is looked upon as the instrument by which to take possession of the absolute, or as the means through which to get a sight of it. The theories of Hegel challenged existing ideas of religion, politics, ethics, and philosophy, which intrigued and influenced Marx's perception of the world. By 1841, Marx's philosophical ideas were a combination of 1. Hegel's idea that all things are a continual process of change resulting from the conflicts between their contradictory aspects, and 2. Ludwig Feuerbach's concept that material conditions above ideas. With a doctorate degree from the University of Jena, Marx began to work at a liberal newspaper in Cologne called the Rheinische Zeitung. In 1842, Karl Marx became editor of Rheinische Zeitung and wrote editorials on the housing of the Berlin poor, the theft of wood by peasants, and the new concept of communism. The newspaper was suppressed by the Prussian government for being too radical and outspoken, which caused Marx to resign as editor in 1843. In June of 1843, Karl Marx married Jenny von Westphalen. 4 months after their wedding, Karl Marx and Jenny von Westphalen moved to Paris, France, which was the center of socialist thought and of the more extreme political sects of communism. After moving to Paris, Marx became a revolutionary and began to associate himself with communist societies of the working class in France and Germany. Marx founded a political journal with Arnold Ruge called the German-French Annals. The journal brought together Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx on August 28, 1844. Friedrich Engels, who was influenced by Hegel, was one of the most important contributors to modern communism and served as the first Marxist after Marx's death. Friedrich Engels said, "When I visited Marx in Paris in the summer of 1844, our complete agreement in all theoretical fields became evident, and our joint work dates from that time. The two became very close friends and would be lifelong collaborators." Marx and Engels criticized philosopher Bruno Bauer and the philosophy of Hegel, as seen in Marx's article Toward the Critique of the Hegelian Philosophy of Right. The first writing project between Engels and Marx was The Holy Family. Published in 1845, the book critiqued the popular views of Bauer and Hegel. Hegel makes man the man of self-consciousness instead of making self-consciousness the self-consciousness of man, of real man, man living in a real objective world and determined by that world. It was from this that Marx began to realize the concepts of philosophy and focused on the uprising of the proletariat. In February 1845, Engels followed Marx to Brussels, Belgium, after Marx was expelled from France for writing for another radical newspaper. In Belgium, Marx completely broke off from Hegelian idealism and started to form his own philosophy and radical ideas. From 1845 to 1846, Marx and Engels wrote the German Ideology, which exposed Marx's theory of historical materialism. This theory explained that societies had been structured to promote the interests of the economically dominant class. However, it was not until 1847, when Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, that Marx's views really began to form. In June of 1847, an organization known as the Communist League was formed, who asked Marx and Engels to join the society and write a manifesto summarizing the doctrines of the League. From December 1847 to January 1848, Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, until it was published on February 21st, 1848.
Of Marx, it was material conditions that really mattered, and so the dialectic is one between different modes of production, and the different periods in history embodied in relationships between different groups of people, those who hold power because they have wealth, and those who don't, who are oppressed.
The Communist Manifesto predicted that the proletarian revolution would make the working men the new ruling class of the world. As it says in the last few lines, the proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite. Then suddenly, the European Revolution of 1848 began because of dissatisfaction with political leadership, demands for participation in government, and the demands of the working class. The revolution started on February 24, 1848 in France, when the revolts were successful in overthrowing King Louis Philippe and established the French Second Republic. Eventually, the movement expanded all throughout Europe, like Austria, Italy, Germany, and Russia. As the revolution was entering Belgium, the government expelled Marx, and Marx moved to Rhineland, where he agitated for an armed revolt. The bourgeois of Europe soon defeated the proletariat, making the revolutions of 1848 unsuccessful because it united the conservative forces and did not bring democratic reform. After the end of the revolutions, Marx settled in London, England, where he would spend the rest of his life. From 1852 to 1862, Marx worked as a journalist and correspondent for the New York Tribune and was financially supported by Engels. Marx wrote on the events that had happened in France and studied economics, which added an even greater depth to his theories. In 1867, Marx published the first volume of Das Kapital about economic theory, which shows the exploitation of the workers by the capitalist system.
Woorden die hij gebruikt over uitbuiting en het uitbuiten van de arbeidersklasse. Ook allemaal begrippen en inzichten die nu nog actueel zijn. Die Fabrikanten erlaubten diesen Fortschritt jedoch nicht ohne einen Kompensierung.
Marx wrote manuscripts for future volumes of Das Kapital that were later finished by Engels. On March 14, 1883, Karl Marx died of pleurisy. 23 years later, Vladimir Lenin would lead the first successful communist revolution.
From the Soviet Revolution of 1917 to the present day, a third of the world's population, 1,500 million people in over 30 countries, have come to live in societies claiming inspiration from the ideas of Karl Marx.
Marxism is a system of socialism of which the dominant feature is public ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange. Marxism stresses for worker socialism against capitalism by suggesting that the working class is distinguished from the middle class, the peasants, and the aristocracy. Karl Marx influenced historic political leaders like Vladimir Lenin and Mao Zedong. Vladimir Lenin led the Russian Revolution, founded the Russian Communist Party, and helped establish the Soviet state. Lenin discovered Das Kapital at university and became a Marxist. During World War I, the Russian people were in a famine condition and were losing major battles, which caused them to rebel against Tsar Nicholas II. Lenin saw this as a major opportunity to start a revolution and return to Russia.
The revolution that Lenin now hoped for was the one predicted by Karl Marx. But Marx's ideas posed a theoretical problem for Russian revolutionaries. Marx believed that the socialist revolution would occur in a developed nation, like Germany or England, when the oppressed working masses revolted against the capitalists.
In February 1917, the Russian Revolution broke out and led to the destruction of the Tsar Empire. Then the Bolsheviks overthrew the provisional government, leading to the Russian Civil War. During the war, Lenin gained control over the government. It was during this time that Lenin revised Marxism into Marxism-Leninism. As Lenin, the head of the communist government, he encouraged trade unions and elimination of all political opposition. However, Vladimir Lenin became fearful of the Communist Party's bureaucracy to control the lives of the Soviet Union and the ambitious General Secretary Joseph Stalin. Mao Zedong helped establish the People's Republic of China and was the leader of the Cultural Revolution. In 1921, Mao Zedong became one of the inaugural members of the Chinese Communist Party and developed Marxist-Leninist ideas. He believed to appeal to the farming peasants in order to establish communism in Asia, which made him launch campaigns like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Mao Zedong created Maoism, which came from Marxist-Leninist thought and focused on strict organizational principles and the importance of armed struggle. In 1958, Mao attempted to increase agricultural and industrial production in the Great Leap Forward, but caused 40 million deaths due to starvation between 1959 and 1961. In August 1966, Mao Zedong launched the Cultural Revolution to reassert his authority.
Mao was convinced the country's moderate leadership was reintroducing capitalism. With a total disregard for the normal process of political change, he urged the students to root out what he called capitalist roaders, by which he meant his political opponents.
The Cultural Revolution led to the deaths of 1.5 million people and the suffering of many. As long as there is capitalism, Karl Marx remains relevant to today's society. Without his influential ideas and theories of economics, philosophy, and world-class struggle, our history and perception of the world would not have been the same.